Chapter 117, Ruined, Asau's POV. Asau drifted for a long time, his brain soupy and confused. Everything had been cold and painful a moment ago. Now he couldn't feel anything. Oh gods, am I dead? He couldn't seem to remember specifics, only that he had been hurt and afraid and Hanyu had been in danger. Was that still the case? What was going on? It seemed to take years to force his eyes open. When he did, however, it only made things worse. Light and colors battered him, and he couldn't seem to focus on anything. "Hello, Asau," said a voice from his side. Asau tried to turn his head, but the muscles wouldn't obey him. When he opened his mouth to speak, he found that his throat was too dry to emit more than a wobbly creak. "It's Julia," the speaker said. "Lord Julia!" Something like relief pierced the fuzzy vagueness of his mind. "I must be safe now." He tried to speak, though he wasn't sure what he meant to say. The sound he produced this time was just as tortured and inarticulate as the last. "Here, have some water." Asau expected to feel a cup at his lips. Instead, a soft cloth touched his mouth and the blessed drops started to trickle down his throat with agonizing slowness. He swallowed automatically and, with that movement, finally felt something. Sharp pain closed over his throat like a fist. It was a familiar pain. He'd felt something like it a few times after Lord Marcus had strangled him. Was that what had happened? Had Lord Antony finally come to the end of his strange patience? "You're going to be all right," Lord Julia said, her voice soothing as it cut through the awful, confusing mess of memories. "You're safe on the ship. I'm sure everything feels very strange right now. I've stuffed you so full of drugs you'll probably piss blue for a week, but I promise that you are going to be just fine." They must have been powerful drugs. He still couldn't get his eyes to work properly. Lord Julia was leaning over him, and even though he knew she must be right in front of him because he could feel the wet cloth she was pressing to his lips, her image was strangely flat. When she pulled back, Asau belatedly remembered his manners and whispered, "Thank you, my lord." His lips were also sore and seemed to be moving strangely, but he was relieved to find that he could shape words well enough to show his gratitude. Lord Julia had no patience for such courtesies. "It's good that you know me. What's your name?" Asau? It would make sense if the god didn't remember, but hadn't she said it herself a moment ago? "Good. Who do you live with?" "Lord Antony? Unless he throttled me and threw me out. Have I been banished?" "Good. Do you remember what happened?" Fuck. Asau had always hated it when he didn't know the answer to a question. He might not understand why Lord Julia was asking him these things, but he found his eyes welling with tears, which only made his visibility troubles worse. It felt like being a child again, even though Lord Julia was not his master and had no license to punish him, so far as he knew. "I'm sorry, my lord," he whispered. Then, unable to help himself, he timidly added, "But I remember Hanyu?" "Hanyu's fine," Lord Julia assured him. "Barely a scratch on him. He's sleeping right on the other side of the room." Thank the gods. Whether or not Asau could quite recall the events that had led to all this, at least he and Hanyu were both all right. The rest could be sorted when his head was clearer. Now that Lord Julia mentioned it, he could hear an intermittent rasp from several feet away. It was the familiar sound of Hanyu snoring, quite softly by his standards. For weeks that sound had terrified Asau as he waited for their master to grow angry about the noise, but now it felt like an embrace, a reassurance. Lord Julia spoke again. "It's all right if you can't remember right now. We'll continue observing you for any signs of brain damage, but everything seems to be in order." It didn't feel like everything was in order. Asau could barely sense any body part below his neck. He tried to wiggle a finger and couldn't be sure whether he'd succeeded. His mind was a thick slurry, and his vision still wasn't quite right. Everything seemed flat, and it was hard to judge distances. To make matters worse, his field of vision had turned unusually narrow. What kind of drugs were these? That is here too, Lord Julia said, startling him from his ponderings. He's shaking his head at me because he doesn't want to bother you, but I thought you'd like to know instead of having him hover at the side like a creepy ghost. You don't want to be a creepy ghost, do you, Thaddy? Julia! Even raised in a whine, it was unmistakably Lord Thaddeus's voice, and Esau couldn't suppress a helpless, happy flutter at the sound. He hasn't left your side all day, Lord Julia said, ignoring her lover's protests. Neither have you, Lord Thaddeus huffed, his voice coming from closer to the cot now. How are you feeling, Esau? Your servant is unworthy of such kind attentions, Esau replied. 2 gods were hovering and attending him as though they were his slaves. It was an honor beyond anything his instructors at the temple would have even thought possible. As such, it would have been the height of effrontery and ingratitude for him to answer that he was sore, sick, and increasingly concerned about everything he couldn't remember. He must have done something horrible. How else could he have pushed kindly Lord Antony to do this to him? There was no doubt now that he'd been banished from his master's ownership. Did Lord Thaddeus's presence mean that his generous offer held? What was more concerning was Hanyu. Lord Julia had said that he was sleeping in the infirmary. Did that mean he had been thrown out too? That seemed unlikely, but he didn't know. Please, my lords, what happened? He ventured at last, unable to bear the confusion and suspense. Are you sure you want to worry about all that right now? Lord Julia hedged. That was strange. Lord Julia could usually be relied upon for straightforward, even blunt answers. Little as he could feel, Esau was quite sure that his heart was beginning to pound. Oh dear, Julia, Lord Thaddeus said in tones of appeal. Don't you think it'll be all right? Fine, sighed the god. Don't distress yourselves. I'll tell you if you're sure that's what you want, Esau. I've displeased her with my pushiness. I mustn't irritate the gods by being too inquisitive. Your humble servant only wishes to be pleasing, my lord, Esau whispered, wishing he could kneel. Surprisingly, she chuckled. Had he ever heard Lord Julia laugh before? It was a low, husky sound, surprisingly pleasant, though Esau had no idea what he'd done to provoke it. If you say so, warrior, she said, which did nothing to alleviate his confusion. When she spoke again, however, her tone had sobered. Well, we're not terribly clear on the first part, but it seems that Marcus kidnapped you and took you to the island as his hostage. Lord Marcus appearing in the room, filling the door with his shoulders, and... She went on speaking, but Esau didn't hear her. Everything was flooding back in a rush that felt like being struck across the brain. He closed his eyes again, suddenly ill. It hadn't been Lord Antony who strangled him, who cut his thighs, and... My eye! My face! Esau didn't realize he'd spoken aloud until Lord Thaddeus answered his panicked thoughts. It's not so bad, really, the god said earnestly. You're alive. That's what matters. Did my master cut my face? Am I remembering that right? Will it scar? Oh gods, oh gods, oh gods! I'm sorry I couldn't save your eye. Esau had never heard Lord Julia sound unsure before, but suddenly her voice was as tiny and meek as that of an offering begging forgiveness. Everything is cleaned and bandaged, though, and your left eye seems to be undamaged. And my face? Even Esau's lungs must have been trembling, because he could barely force enough steady breath through his stiff, sore lips to form a whisper. Please, my lords, may I... A mirror, please, I'll do anything, please! He shouldn't be making these promises. If Lord Antony hadn't thrown him out, then it was still his master's decision what Esau did. He had nothing to bargain with, but he had to see the damage for himself, had to know. I'm not sure that's a good idea, Lord Julia replied, hedging yet again. The stitches are fresh, and everything will look worse than it really is. Stitches! A boy in a cadre several years behind theirs had cut his chin while playing in the temple courtyard. It had needed stitches, and the injury had left a visible scar, and the boy had been sold and his replacement purchased within a week. Asau's whole body felt as though it were seizing in his sudden, wild terror. "You're scaring him, love," Lord Thaddeus said firmly. "Asau, of course you can have a mirror if that's what you want." Lord Julia sighed. "I'll ask Cloelia." There were footsteps, then a door creaking as it opened. "Cloelia helped lock Marcus in the brig," Lord Thaddeus said, by way of explanation. "But that wasn't quite enough for her. She's been standing guard outside this door all day. I'm sure she'll be back with a mirror any minute now." "Lord Marcus is locked up? What happened?" Immediately, Asau realized his own stupidity. Of course, even the ship's second would have to be punished for damaging his lord's property. "Damaging! Please, please let me be damaged and not ruined!" Heavy footsteps thundered up to the door, then stopped. When Lord Cloelia spoke, she was clearly struggling to keep her voice soft. The result was a whisper that Asau could hear right through the heavy door. "I've got it! Tell him I said congratulations on not being dead!" "Thank you, my lord," Asau replied automatically. "Shit, you can hear me? Sorry, I'll be quiet." The door shut with a vehemence that momentarily disrupted Hanyu's snoring. When Lord Julia approached with the small round mirror, even Asau's disjointed eyes, I could see that she looked troubled. "Just remember, it will be better once it's healed and the stitches are out," she cautioned, before reluctantly lifting it so Asau could see his face. It took a distressingly long time for him to take in what he was seeing. Horrible visions played through his mind as he waited for his one eye to focus on the image in the mirror. Once it did, the reality was even worse than his most gruesome imaginings. Angry red wounds and neat black stitches seemed to cover his whole face. One nostril had been slashed, and the stitches were sure to leave it mangled. His cheeks were a wreckage. His lips, a perfect bow shape, the priest had said 100 times, were sliced and stitched in 2 places. The only respite from the ghastly vision was the clean white bandage that covered his right eye and most of the rest of that side of his face, hiding, he was sure, even more carnage. Ruined. Utterly, irretrievably ruined. "Oh," he whimpered, ashamed of how small and weak his voice sounded. "They'll send me to the kitchens for sure. What god would allow me to blight their vision? I'm disfigured. I'm finished." "It'll get better," Lord Julia said, and the small, humble tone was back. "I have ointments and... Shit, Asau, I'm sorry. Is this my punishment for all the times I wished I could be permanently excused from sexual service? Or when I wanted to be an ugly shark? Did I bring this on myself? I should have been fucking grateful that I was an acceptable fuck toy. Now I'm nothing." "Sweetheart," Lord Thaddeus said tenderly, and for one wild moment Asau thought the god was speaking to him, but of course he was addressing Lord Julia. "I'm in awe of everything you've done over the last several hours. You've been buried in patients all night and watched them all day, and you have done everything you possibly could. You're in desperate need of a few minutes out of this room. Why don't you and Cloelia get something to eat? I need to have a word with Asau." Lord Julia huffed, sounding a little less terrifyingly fragile. "Some things never change. Is food always going to be your solution to everything, Thaddy?" "Probably." There was the soft sound of a kiss. Then Lord Julia padded to the door and left. "She and Lord Thaddeus have been wasting their time and kindness on me, and this is how I repay them? By spitting in the face of Lord Julia's healing? No amount of shock can excuse this kind of rank boorishness." "Forgive your stupid servant, my lord," Asau dared to whisper. "I didn't mean to be ungrateful. I know I'm unworthy of Lord Julia's generosity. I never meant to suggest... But I did. I implied that the efforts of a god weren't good enough for an ugly, homeless slave. Oh, fuck, no wonder he wants a word with me. He's going to reprimand me the way this behavior warrants. I can't keep acting like this. I'm going to need to beg and abase myself for every scrap of mercy from now on, and I need to learn my place right away. Oh, dear. Oh, Esau. He didn't deserve the gentleness in that tone. Of course you're not unworthy. Please forgive her. She wouldn't usually take it so personally, but she's had a very long night. And of course, the fact that it's you, she adores you. She doesn't like to let you down. Esau flinched, mortified. I have no excuse. You are allowed to feel however you need to feel about what Marcus has done to your body, Lord Thaddeus countered. It's terrible, and it never should have happened. Not before, and not now. But I just wanted to say, thank you. It must have been a nightmare, but you did what you needed to do to survive. I can't tell you how grateful I am for that. Thank you for being so strong, Esau. I wasn't strong. A good, strong, loyal slave wouldn't have let himself be stolen. I cried and groveled for a God who was no longer my master. I gave myself to him without reservations, even though I am not my own to give. I let my master's property be ruined, and now no one will ever want me again. But as little as he warranted the god's praise, there could be no doubt that Lord Thaddeus was sincere when he offered it. His voice was so earnest it hurt to hear. It would have been good to be his. I would have loved to belong to such an honest master. I should have appreciated his offer more when I had it. I've been so ungrateful. No wonder this happened. You are kinder than your servant deserves, Esau managed. He hoped that the thickness of his voice would be attributed to the drugs. It would have been an honor to be yours, my lord. Lord Thaddeus hesitated for a long moment, then Esau felt the breeze as his hands began to flap. Would have been? I don't... Have you made up your mind not to live with me, then? He sounded sad, but not surprised. Esau, mind slow and lazy from the painkillers, tried to sort through what that could mean. That's all right, you know, the god said earnestly. I understand. I'm sorry to hear your decision, but of course I respect it. Esau blinked his eyes, trying in vain to clear his thoughts. My decision? Surely my lord no longer wishes to claim me? Of course I don't want to claim you against your will. Lord Thaddeus sounded more vehement than Esau had heard him since that night on the deck, the night a god had found him worth protecting. Never! It would not have been against my will, Lord, Esau whispered, and at the thought of the cozy rooms where he would never live, the quiet bed that would never be his, a hot tear trickled down the side of his ruined face. But surely my lord can't possibly want me any more. Not after this. What? Lord Thaddeus leaned closer, both his hands now batting wildly at the air. I don't understand. You think I don't want you anymore because you're a hero? Because you were unbelievably brave and saved our friend's life? I didn't save his life. I barely slowed my old master down. It didn't matter. Nothing I have ever done has mattered even the tiniest bit. No, Esau managed, another tear escaping his one burning eye. Because, my lord, I'm not beautiful anymore. There, he'd finally said it aloud, finally let it be real. He'd spent his life striving to be a beautiful, pleasing toy, and then he wasn't pleasing anymore, and now he wasn't even beautiful. He had become pointless. Lord Thaddeus made a soft, shocked noise and leaned forward to grasp the edge of the cot. The god's eyes were wide and sad, and Esau had a sudden, horrible premonition. He's going to say I'm still beautiful. Gods, he's going to lie to me. Fuck beautiful, if you'll pardon my language, Lord Thaddeus said sharply. You are fierce. Esau was supposed to be sweet and submissive and humble. He was supposed to be beautiful and pleasing, as he never would be again. He was definitely not supposed to be fierce. Hearing that word should have crushed him. It should have been the last thing in the world that could have made him feel even a little bit better. There was no way that it should have made him feel an echo of that full, sharp sensation he felt when he stabbed his master's foot. It shouldn't have made his bandaged shoulders square up a little under the infirmary blanket. But then, nothing ever turned out the way it should. "Do you mean, would my lord still be willing to take ownership of me?" he whispered, hardly daring even to hope the words, let alone say them. "If you wanted to live with me, I wouldn't just be willing, I would be thrilled," Lord Thaddeus said, and the certainty in his voice blazed so strongly that he sounded a little fierce himself. "Julia and Cloelia and I would all be thrilled, Esau. You are so brave. We're in awe of you." "I don't deserve these words. They're blasphemous. But perhaps gods are allowed to blasphemize?" "And, of course, if we can convince Antony to let you go," Thaddeus continued. That statement was strange enough to shake Esau from his musings. "Surely my master no longer... Hasn't Lord Antony conveyed his wishes about me? Didn't he say he no longer wanted me?" "Well, he's hardly in a position to say anything right now," Lord Thaddeus said with a pitying sigh. "His poor tongue! Muscles take ages to grow back properly." Esau caught himself. He needed to choose his words more carefully than he had been doing. He'd been offered a miraculous second chance, and the last thing he needed to do was jeopardize that by being impolite or insufficiently submissive. "May your humble servant inquire as to what my lord means?" "You didn't know?" Lord Thaddeus asked, then sighed. "Of course not. You were unconscious. Oh, dear." "Please, my lord," Esau pressed, feeling an uncomfortable sense of premonition. "Has some mishap befallen Lord Antony?" Lord Thaddeus cleared his throat. "About that,"